The Mound of Vendôme is a historical project to reconstruct an earthwork built by the revolutionary Commune de Paris and used in their controversial demolition of the Vendôme column. And this is a project about this specific event, which I'll explain to you, its history and how we might remember it. But I also like to think of this as a project that I hope poses questions about the types of historical landscapes, the type of nature, or what some people call socio-nature, that become reconstructed and historicized in our cities today, and why that happens. And I think for me, this political project of urban nature and environmental reconstruction, and what kinds of natures get historicized, what kinds of forms of nature in the cities become reconstructed, I think these are two themes that are so absolutely critical right now and are driving so much types of research, not just about the history of cities, but also about the future of cities. And I think this has nothing to do with the Commune de Paris, but I think this is a great example of a type of nature reconstruction, a type of historical project that is happening right now, that has very important ramifications or political consequences for the city, and also makes very powerful political arguments. So just briefly, this is a fascinating and I think somewhat important research project by a man named Eric Sanderson, who published a book called Manhattan. Maybe you've seen this book, but it's in a sense a environmental reconstruction of Manhattan before Western contact. And so on the left, you see these images of what Manhattan might have looked like, and he's using several archival documents to create these images, and what it looks like today, what Manhattan must have looked like immediately before European contact on the west in the 16th century. And on the right, you see an image that describes what Manhattan talks about on the left, today. And on the right, you'll notice another image. He uses this book to make an argument about what Manhattan will become. And his idea is that Manhattan's history must become more like the environmental history of its past. And so I don't know if how well the resolution is on the slide, but you might notice that the Guggenheim Museum now has a green roof, and then the Metropolitan Museum of Art is like a natural history museum with a big biome in which the nature of the past of the city can become reconstructed. And all of the roofs are green. And these are very like ecological types of histories of cities. I'm sure this type of thing is either in the works or has been done in Montreal. And while I think they're fascinating, I think it's our obligation as historians to resurrect natures or to make histories about forms of nature or environments that are not necessarily comforting to remember, comforting to recall, environments that have more provocative implications for the future of our cities. So just to give you some examples of some research that's very much inspires my own thinking about how one might think about the kinds of natures or landscapes that get made in cities. I'm completely interested and inspired to some degree by the types of debates that are happening around the Los Angeles River on the West Coast where I live. This is the Los Angeles River today. You may notice these images may look familiar to you from movies such as Grease or Terminator 2, right? And so it was once a natural landscape, okay? And then it was filled with concrete in the 1930s, and it's sometimes this trickle, sometimes this enormous amount of water there. But today people are thinking about how to reconstruct it. So a colleague of mine named David Fletcher is trying to figure out a way to construct the nature that used to be back in this site today, but to acknowledge that there's a very unique ecology or a very unique form of nature that's within this landscape, that's within the concrete itself, from everything from weeds to the types of animals that are there. And there's other people who are somewhat more radical, like Matthew Gandy, who argues that if the kinds of historians and geographers that are coming to this site spoke Spanish, that they would realize that there's actually the most incredible socioecology in the concrete river itself, and would demand not only its history, but also its preservation as well. So some other projects that I like to think about in terms of how we might think about urban landscapes and nature. In the early, I think 2003 or 2004, a PhD student at Columbia University wrote a very powerful thesis in which he created a thought experiment, which is, what if one tried to historically preserve the entirety of the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York City? And the Cross Bronx Expressway is an expressway that was built by Robert Moses in the 1950s and completed in the 1950s in New York. And it was, in a sense, this this project that involved the destruction of enormous amounts of neighborhoods and driving this highway through these neighborhoods. I know you have things like this here in Montreal, and an extremely controversial construction. And Michael Karatzis argues that we need to consider this, even though this history is horrible, or because this history is so horrible of what happened here, we have to think about this in terms of a historical and preservation project. So he went to this fascinating site exercise, fascinating thought exercise in which he considered all of the things that would have to happen to preserve this thing. And actually inspired by Michael's research several years ago for a different exhibition that was curated by Jeff Maynow, myself and a small team of renderers made these images that would maybe show what this site might look like if it had a more sort of historical sense versus an engineering sense. I could go on with examples that inspire you, but I just want to show you some of the interesting thinking that's happening around urban nature today and its history before I go into the specifics of this project. Finally, in terms of this very quick survey of what's happening out there right now, I wanted to mention some fascinating research by Donna Haraway, who came to speak at my college, the California College of the Arts, and who compelled us in the audience to think about the nature in the city in very powerful and provocative and historical ways. So Donna Haraway is a very important anthropologist to how we think about interactions between human beings and animals and human beings and machines. And right now she's doing research about what she calls the bastard species of empire. And what she argues is that all our cities are filled with animals that were brought here through processes of imperialization and colonization, and they're all now, as she uses the term bastards, it's not obviously a very nice word, but she says they're all now disowned by us. We look at animals like this and we think of them as unwanted. These are pigeons. Pigeons were brought to Montreal, to London, to New York City, to Montreal, to New York City, to Los Angeles, etc., as meat. People ate them. And Donna Haraway says we need to rekindle our relationship with the pigeon, okay? And she's explored various communities or urban neighborhoods, particularly in California, where people have begun to eat pigeons again and cook them. And she's very interested in this as a way to not resolve, but to bring back a history that once existed in space. So my work definitely comes out of this, we might call it a post-structural approach to historicizing nature and landscapes, but all within the urban context. So the Mound of Vendôme, with this project I wanted to ask a question that I don't know, it's very difficult to self-reflect about one's own work. I don't know how original this question is, and I'm not sure how important that particular issue is, but the question I wanted to ask was how can this new approach, let's call it, to urban landscape history, to approaches to reconstruction, how could this more experimental form of history and urban geography, how could it be oriented towards a landscape that emerged from urban revolution and revolt? And just to give you maybe maybe an American context very, very quickly on this whole topic. So in the United States, the two key French revolutions, or the three key French revolutions, 1789, 1848, and 1871, are all taught as very important episodes in how societies, obviously how social relationships transformed, but also in how people thought about revolution itself. And in a sense, they're very, there's an enormous amount of Anglophone research on all three of these revolutions. Obviously, 1789 probably does not come as a surprise, but 1848 and particularly 1871, the Commune de Paris, are very key objects of study. And so this research is also a response to that, the sort of sense that something very important happened in Paris at this time, and how we think about it has major implications for how we think about issues of protest and revolution today in ways that I'll hopefully explain with some examples. So just for those of you that are a little bit less familiar on the history of the Commune, I thought I would just explain it, get us to the Place Vendôme, the Mound, and then more deeply into my own project. So the Commune de Paris is an urban revolt that emerges in the wake of the French loss in the Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III was the ruler of France, and he was lured into, or emperor of France, he was lured into a battle with the Prussians, what's known as the Franco-Prussian War. He lost in a major defeat at the Battle of Sedan. He abdicated his rule, and at this time also the city of Paris was under siege by the Parisian army. and the fédérés, or the National Guard, which were these neighborhood units in the various quartiers of Paris, were very well armed and had cannon and rifle and were involved with the defense of Paris. Now, the new government that came in Napoleon III's wake, the government of national defense, which was headed by Monsieur Thiers, it signed an armistice with the Prussians and basically signed away Paris, so to speak. The Prussians came in and marched in Paris. The people in these National Guard units were infuriated, and just weeks later, the forces of the French national government came to disarm the Parisian populace, and there was a revolt. And people said the National Guardsmen would not give up their weapons. People came to the top of Montmartre, which you see in this site, also, by the way, a very important, interesting kind of outre urban landscape, came to the top of here and began a very important series of protests and revolts against the National Army. The National Army fled, Thiers fled, and the resulting political activist groups and citizenry in Paris and the Fédérés declared the Commune de Paris an autonomous revolutionary government separate from the national government. Now, the Commune is something that is romanticized, historicized in so many complex ways. It combined French republicanism, socialist ideas. It was had a very ambitious social project, even though it only lasted 2.5 months. It wanted to provide free education to women. They wanted to transform rules surrounding rent and labor. But the entirety of the Commune, it was really preoccupied with defending Paris now from French troops, national troops, who were trying to retake it. So among the accomplishments or among the goals of the Commune, one of them was to transform the urban iconography of Paris itself, which had radically transformed between the time of Napoleon and Napoleon III. And so they carried out several different public destructions and demolitions, including the demolition of the Place Vendôme column. Now, the column, in an effort to transform the iconography of the city, in a way I'll explain just now. So the Place Vendôme column was built in 1810 as a way to celebrate and remember Napoleon's victories in Austerlitz, his victories over the Austrian army. Napoleon originally wanted to bring Trajan's column in Rome, have it disassembled and brought to the center of the Place Vendôme to stand here, okay, in the middle of the square, but his advisors thought it would both be symbolically and economically prohibitive. And so basically a reconstruction of Trajan's column was created in bronze that now didn't celebrate Trajan's victories, but celebrated the exploits of Napoleon. And eventually, at the termination of the column's design, a statue of Napoleon as emperor was put on the top. Now, as we all know, Napoleon was eventually exiled, came back, exiled again. As governments came and went, the top of the column would continually transform. The Napoleon as emperor was taken down, and the fleur-de-lis was put up on top, the tricolore. Eventually, Napoleon as citizen, a statue of Napoleon as citizen was put on top. And when Napoleon III came to power, he undertook a very controversial renovation of the statue, in which he not only cleaned and renovated the statue, but he put a new cast statue of his uncle as emperor, very similar to the original one, if not almost identical, back on top of the statue. And it's at this moment that this statue becomes an immensely hated object of the French intellectual and cultural and political left, who begin to see it as, in a word we use today, but they wouldn't use then, as a kind of fascistic monument, a monument to a ruler's empire, a monument to militarism, a monument that very much seems against Republican values. So in the 2.5 months that the Commune existed, they had 3 different type of public demolitions or decrees. One was the destruction of the house of Thiers himself, the head of the national government outside of Paris. One was the burning of the guillotines in Place Bastille as a protest against capital punishment, and they enacted a prohibition against any form of capital punishment. And then finally, the demolition of the Place Vendôme, which you can see the decree that has kind of extraordinary language to it in the gallery. It's been reproduced and placed on the wall. So the demolition itself, the contract for the demolition of the decree was very interesting in the sense that they wanted to destroy this monument to transform the iconography of Paris, to remove a symbol of empire and what they saw was military brutality from the center of Paris. But they wanted to be very careful about how they did it, how they undertook this demolition of the column. Now, in the literature from the time, pro-communard writers describe it as a demolition, and anti-communard writers describe it as a destruction. So was the column destroyed or demolished, right? And it has a shift in English language in terms of how you would understand it, of course. So, and French as well, obviously. So anyway, so the way to negotiate, so what they wished to do is to destroy this column, but to preserve the surrounding buildings. And very importantly, they were worried about the column falling and destroying the street. And the street, underneath the street is an enormous sewer that was built by Haussmann, and they were worried about the entire street caving in, the windows on the buildings cracking, and it destroying the historical architecture of the Place Vendôme itself. So a man named Jules Ribe and Georges Cavalier came up with the concept of creating this enormous mound of hay, of sand, and as Giovanna mentioned, also of horse manure, fumier de cheval. And this was, you know, there's many ways that we can, so this landscape was made to, in a sense, absorb the weight. It was, in a sense, a cushion. Now, there's many ways we can think about this mound. So on the one, you know, it's amazing that one could spend so much time on such a thing, I know. Anyway, there's many ways that we can think about this mound. So on the one hand, one can think of it as changing the, or appropriating the ecology of Haussmann's transformations to Paris. After all, under Haussmann, all kinds of regulations came for the collection of horse manure, of hay, and of cleaning that were quite new in Paris. And so this kind of process that would result in the collection of all this material was taken and appropriated to bring it all here. There was also numerous excavation sites from the various renovations and constructions that were still going on in the city. So the sand and soil comes from there. My research assistant, Samuel Garcia, in Paris, working in the National Archives, pulled out some material that suggested that the people that made the mound were actually inspired by the type of military fortifications that were going up around Paris at this time, while it was first under siege from the Prussians and then under siege from the national government. So these are large constructions of hay, manure, and sand that are bundled together with sticks that absorb explosive cannon fire. And then maybe one of the most charming, if interesting and provocative, associations was one that was actually suggested to me by Alessandra Ponte, who's here this evening. And this is that the mound may have been in some way associated with the types of revolutionary mounds that were made in the original French Revolution of 1789. And this is from La Fête de l'Être Suprême, the Festival of the Supreme Being, that was these sort of quasi-French Republican religious festivals overseen by Robespierre, in which large artificial mountains were made and symbolic objects were hoisted on top of them. And as we know from historians of the Commune imagined itself as sort of rekindling some of the spirit of 1789. So this comparison is actually very, very interesting and provocative and compelling. And one can look at what the Commune achieved was, instead of hoisting symbols on top of a mound, was in a sense using the mound as this sort of, as Giovanna put it, this anti-monument, this place in which objects would be destroyed. So in the middle of May of 1871, they began the process of bringing the column down. And you can see here this capstan, or large pulley, that's put in the Rue de la Paix. You see the pulleys extending up to the top of the column, and that scaffolding is obscuring a cut that they made in the column. It's almost like they cut it like a tree trunk. And this thing, after all, is enormous. It's as thick as a sequoia and has a stairway moving through it. I think in this image, yes, here, this was actually made by an American newspaper that was witnessing the events. Here you can see the cut. Here the mound is drawn as this massive Egyptian earthwork, and the sort of pathetic barricades that you see here are drawn as if this is some kind of fantastic fort by Vauban or something. You know, it's a kind of amazing rhetorical image. Anyway, so the column comes down. The material lands in the mound, the street is protected, the sword doesn't crack, etc. But again, the functionalism of the mound may not be the most extraordinary aspect of it. A large festival took place immediately on top of the debris from the monument. Songs were sung. The drapeau rouge was put on top of the base of the column. And the place was renamed Place Internationale. And one of the writers who was recounting the scene made a speech at the foot of the base of the former Vendôme column, and said this was once an altar. He's talking about the base. of the column. This was once an altar to war, now it's an altar to peace. And so the whole thing must have been exciting and thrilling for people that were there at the time. And this celebration was very shortly lived. Just 5 days later, 4 or 5 days later, the forces of the national government were slowly breaking through the walls and fortifications, the Parisian fortifications. They retook the square on May 23rd, the Place Vendôme on May 23rd, and they began a process of trying to preserve the remnants of the column that still remained there. And during this time, of course, there's enormous amount of fighting and destruction that's happening in the center of Paris. I don't need to get into too many of the details, but there's still a lot of debates among historians as to how many communards were killed, the summary executions, the burnings of buildings that happened in the center of Paris was all quite horrible. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I just want to say something about this and some of the other images. These are all also very important images in the history of urban photographic documentation. The CCA's collection has some of the finest of these albums and images that were made both during the Commune and immediately after the Commune was suppressed, of photographs of various ruins and actions that were undertaken by the Commune or scenes from the fighting. In English, we might say that this is the first example of what we call ruin porn, the kinds of photographic images we see of other kinds of forms of urban destruction and demolitions that happen in cities. And so the albums that you'll see in the gallery were actually circulated all over the Western world and became popular collector items to see what had unfolded in Paris. And the kind of vividness of the photographs are really pretty incredible. So anyway, so the Government of National Defense set out a contract to the Monduit foundry and the architect Alfred Normand, and the bits of the column that could be salvaged were salvaged. All the other material in the square was swept away, and the Monduit foundry began the 2 or 3 year process of rebuilding the panels, and Alfred Normand of overseeing the reconstruction of the column. Monduit was also the foundry that built the Statue of Liberty, so very important metal workers in the history of urban sculpture. So this is an image of the scaffolding. By the way, the photographs and drawings of the reconstruction were also very important kind of symbolic artifacts of the process of repairing the destructions or demolitions and damage that was done both under the Commune and also the siege and the Civil War. So, there's a lot of debates as to how monuments were built in Paris immediately after the fall of the Commune. What was the first post-communard monument in Paris? And one may argue that the rebuilding of the Place Vendôme column, or the column itself, becomes the first anti-communard monument in Paris, because the writing that was surrounding it when it was rebuilt was that this was now a symbol, a monument to the regaining of order in Paris and the suppression of the Commune itself, of the Reds. So now these meanings are probably lost to us, but at the time this would have been very clear that the reconstruction of this was a very symbolic act against what had just transpired in Paris. So speaking of Commune remembrance, since 1871 there has been, and at times intense, but otherwise much softer attempts to figure out how to recall and memorialize these events. And I think it's still an issue in a broader sense outside the Commune. A young historian at MIT who I like very much, whose writing I like very much, named Anne-Marie Léon, published a very interesting collection of essays about the histories of revolution. And she argues how, as historians or as monument makers or as architects, how do we recount these events? How are revolutions, which have such fleeting qualities to them, how exactly are they remembered? Anyway, so since 1871, there have been various efforts immediately following for the state to recall what had happened under the Commune, to build new monuments that were, in a sense, anti-communard. And among the former members of the Commune, or les amis de Commune, the friends of the Commune, efforts to figure out how to memorialize the Commune itself. And almost all of communard remembrances in Paris involve the martyrdom of the communards themselves, their deaths, their fighting, and so on. In 2011, I was extremely, actually learned about this after starting to work on this project, but in 2011, a French artist collective called Rasputin was one summer in Paris putting up banners that were these temporary banners to display scenes of the fighting and to show the kinds of things that happened there. And I think probably for many Parisians or tourists, it was the first time they realized the column had fallen. This is a banner showing the demolition in the Place Vendôme. It's attached to one of the stairs that go down to the parking garage that's now under the Place Vendôme. And on the right, you see images of the burning of the guillotine that I described. Now, the year of this, I think, is very important. This is 2011. This is a time in which we're seeing urban revolts and revolutions in northern Africa, right? And also in the United States, with the Occupy movement, we are seeing images of urban protest and revolt. And in the city where I live, of Oakland, California, I was very taken with how the Occupy movement in Oakland itself was resorting to imagery from the Commune to articulate its own aims and interests. And these are actually photographs from the Occupy movement in Oakland, in which, Paris 1871, Oakland 2011, Oakland Commune, and if you notice on the upper left-hand corner of that photograph, there's these large mounds of hay upon which people made speeches and made things. Not that that mound of hay has anything to do with the one in Paris, but just the kind of imagery continues. And I think many historians would argue that both the revolutions in Paris of 1848 and 1871 gave us the grammar of urban Western revolution. Build a barricade, occupy a square, rally around a monument, and make a protest. And this, I know it sounds absurd to give it as a kind of formula, but these kinds of moments or actions do tend to repeat themselves and are based very much on a kind of French revolutionary imagery. This is from the Occupy Wall Street. An artist named Zoe Beloff hired actors to actually play communards during another protest. So this idea of reenactment and remembrance runs through acts of urban revolt itself in a very self-conscious kind of way, one that is not spontaneous in any way, but is quite staged to associate contemporary actions with former actions. Anyway, it's within this context that I've been doing research on these events for a number of years and had always been trying to fit the story of the Mound into various projects, but it's such a big story, it never worked in association with something else. It seemed to demand its own type of project. And so in 2012, February of 2012, after all of these various events have unfolded, these contemporary events have just unfolded, I wrote this petition on this blog that I used to keep up with called History, Theory, and Criticism Experiments. And I wrote this petition about how we should rebuild the Mound. This is a terrible drawing. I had no idea what I wanted to do yet. And my research, I had not yet done the really serious archival research to understand exactly what it looked like. I'd only seen drawings and heard stories, or things in writings. Anyway, but I was also very interested in the petition form as a way to recount the history of the Mound, and also as a way as like a sort of historian who's taking on an activist role to make an argument for its reconstruction. And so, there's several reasons that I was interested in this particular, in actually both making a history of this thing, but also literally reconstructing it, or at least proposing the possibility of its own reconstruction. On the one hand, I feel like it forces this very important kind of confrontation with the history of the city, right? That it particularly the history of revolutionary movements, which are so fleeting. What happened there, the Mound existed for 6, 7, 8 hours, and what happened there was just there for several weeks before completely disappearing. How do we recall these important events? I was also, at the time, I very much interested in a kind of disciplinary confrontation, like thinking about the kinds of landscapes that we can historicize or reconstruct in cities. Where I live in California, we're always reconstructing historical landscapes, whether it's Native American landscapes or early frontier landscapes or ecologies that existed before any Westerners ever arrived. And landscape reconstruction has become a kind of process in and of itself, and I wanted to wield that process to something that seemed far more political, in a sense, and far more social, historical, and urban than ecological, one might say. And then finally, I think if one can imagine this standing there just for one day, this mound being reconstructed, however unlikely that may seem, I think we can combine this kind of disciplinary interest with these kinds of very important urban concerns about the kinds of iconography that we bring back into the city. Anyway, so working with the renderer that I often work with in London, who did the images out there, we made some of the first images of what a reconstructed Mound of Vendôme might look like. And these images are a bit coarse, But they were important for me to show a non-ecological vision of an urban nature reconstruction. And so the idea of the glass box is not just to make this, pile of filth, not just to make it seem more monumental, but also to proclaim that it's not a site for life, that it's a site, it's a historical object, not an ecological artifact that would eventually have flowers and birds on it and so forth. There's, of course, this tremendous irony about putting $500 worth of material in a $2 million glass box, but nonetheless, it's this kind of provocative images that got the projects going. And so the project began taking on a life of its own and was eventually exhibited at the San Francisco Art Institute in a really fascinating exhibition about temporary structures, which dealt with the kind of politics surrounding temporary structures and the kinds of various acts of reconstruction that make structures often seem temporary. So here you see the installation in the background is actually a very important performance piece by an artist named Paul Cosse that's actually based upon Notre Dame in Paris. And it was actually originally built in the wall. You see that arch, and the curators realized that it was actually still inside the wall. So for the exhibition, they took away the drywall and remade this piece, and somebody climbs up it. Anyway, but this artifact that begins to develop a kind of audience for this particular project. And then eventually working with the Canadian Center for Architecture here, who partially funded a trip that I made to Paris to meet with people from Les Amis de Commune, as well as various architects there and archivists, etc. This project began taking on a life that suggested it might be something more than just a drawing or a petition. And so the man on the left is Marc Lagana, who's the head cultural commissioner of the Friends of the Commune in Paris, as well as two architects, both of whom teach in Paris and are very interested in similar concerns, who have helped push the project softly forward, including others, the architect Philippe Rahm and several other people that work in City Hall in Paris who are now potentially interested in this thing happening. So just to give you, how am I doing on time? I'm okay? Yeah? Okay. So this kind of monument, this kind of proposal to create this mound actually has, I think, a very good function for contemporary commune remembrance or societies like Les Amis de Commune that very much owns how the commune is remembered. And much of commune remembrance, as I mentioned, surrounds issues of martyrdom or the sites of fighting. And as historians or revisionist historians show more and more that actually many, many less people died during this time, that the fighting was much less gruesome than we had believed, that this project of martyrdom becomes less tenable for them, that they become interested in a project like this that was really about a kind of effort to think about the city itself, okay, and to think about how urban protests can transform urban spaces. So while I was actually just a week after I left Paris, this man who has very libertarian politics named Terry Bourne actually dumped a pile of hay and of manure in front of the National Assembly in Paris as a kind of protest. And I was completely fascinated. He made it look so easy, something that I was trying to desperately do. So without turning this into a comedy routine, I actually emailed him, and I was like, "That's amazing." We have completely different kinds of viewpoints, but I was actually completely amazed that he had done this. And apparently, during his sentencing, he was in prison briefly. During his sentencing, his sentence was that he could never dump manure again, which was the most kind of fascinating. So he was out of the project. He's just a consultant now. So, but here he is. His truck on the side of it says Hollande and the whole political class out. So anyway, so they cleaned this up very quickly. So actually, I was extremely curious what this would be like, and as I find myself increasingly getting wrapped up among my own and other people's desires to see this happen, I was increasingly wondering what this would look like. And actually, near my house is an enormous stable complex called Golden Gate Fields, and they dump tons and tons of hay mixed with manure every day. I was talking to them about the project, and they told me that it's really just stable scrapings. It's not such a big deal. It's not such a tremendous, complicated thing to acquire. Anyway, so they move this every day. So working very quickly. They told me I showed them the drawings. They told me they'd make something that kind of looked like it. But anyway, the point was, it's not very good. But the point was that it was very easy. In fact, they told me they made it in 4 minutes. But it was this kind of thing that was like fascinating. And there's a kind of effectual quality to this project where actually studying something for so long and being around it actually has a kind of powerful quality. And of course, humor, of course, underlies a lot of this particular project. Anyway, so working with some people in Paris City Hall, we were told that they would work with us to have a one-day permit to make this for one day. Actually, through a film permit, believe it or not, because a film permit, part of the contractual basis of a film permit is that the set, as it's called, has to be built in a day and taken down in a day. So this was something that was completely reasonable for them. We commissioned new renderings to suggest something more, in open air, a series of drawings that explain the entire construction and demolition process of this object. Our hope is to hold a conference there at the Mound as a kind of backdrop to discuss issues of urban landscape reconstruction, historicizing urban revolt, how histories of nature or the histories of landscapes and cities generally become forgotten or remembered. And then, of course, all of this is in the galleries next to this theater, in which you can see these renderings. And just one final word on these renderings. They're actually a lot of fun to make. Victor, who made the original renderings in the glass box, made this new rendering of the mound, which we now actually have a much better sense of what it was really made from. But also, this is a contemporary photograph, but we removed all sense of this photograph that it was in fact contemporary. All the people, the cars, the trucks, the signs, the satellite dishes that are on top of all of the buildings there, to give this this historical sense of that seems appropriate for a reconstruction. And anyway, so a very very challenging but very exciting project to work on. And as Giovanna mentioned, it is a project about reconstructing this historical object. It is a project about the urban landscape, but it's also very much a project about how one works with an institution like the CCA, and how, in addition to the kinds of wonderful books and texts and other things that people like myself and others have made working with the archives here, how we can use the archives here and all of the images I've shown you here from the archives to produce other things that begin to make history, again, sort of a more integrative aspect of our experience of the city. So that is my little speech, and thank you. Yeah.